Hey folks, so recently I recommended a book, Stand Out of Our Light by James Williams, and he was an advertising guru, I think programming and advertising for Google, and he got a little bit of a crisis of conscience and ended up leaving to go study philosophy at Oxford University, and one of the results is this book. And as he was working in that position, he began to become concerned about the adversarial nature of the technology and how it's aligned really against us and not for us. The book takes its title from a story about the prophet, the philosopher Diogenes, 325, BC. And, he was a pretty rude guy. He was the ultimate troll. But, Alexander the Great was a little bit intrigued. And one day Alexander the Great stands over him and says, "Hey, you're really impressing me. I'd like to give you the desire of your heart. Ask me for anything." And he replies, "Stand out of my light." And he uses this the author uses that little story to talk about the attention economy and how we're in a crisis of attention, how all of these technologies, Facebook, Twitter, your computer, are all basically designed to commandeer your attention. And they want to hold that attention as long as possible. So, for example, the algorithms for Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, etc., are all designed to try to keep you there as long as possible. Now, I've been interested in this stuff, and I've been asking this question for a number of different reasons, because I'm looking at kind of the social change that we're going through on a macro level, and we're trying to understand all of what's going on here, because there's much more going on than just political tension or racial tension. There's something much more going on. You can feel it. It feels like there's something else underneath this, fueling it and exacerbating it and making it worse. And so I want to get down to the bottom of that. Not too long ago, I wrote an article which appears on Medium about the collapse of trust in the West and America. In particular, we don't trust any institution any longer. Everything is experiencing a crisis of trust, whether you're an expert at something like a doctor or a scientist, or whether it's religious or political. There's just a huge crisis of truth. There's a huge problem with that, because when there's a crisis of truth, you can't trust anybody. Added to that, we're flooded with information. And that information comes upon us so quickly that we lose our ability to parse it. In other words, most of us can't be experts enough or well-read enough, or even maybe have the comprehension or the attentional faculties enough to deal with all of that information and kind of put it in its right perspective and its right slots. That becomes very difficult. It becomes even more difficult when the technology itself is designed to keep you sort of from doing that, right? When the technology itself is meant to push you and persuade you in certain directions, this way or that. And ultimately, underneath it, there's an advertising ethos underneath it. In other words, we're doing this. The reason why Google or Facebook or Twitter, the reason why they exist really is fundamentally to earn income. And if that's the reason for their existence, then it doesn't have your best interest in mind. It doesn't have my best interest in mind. It doesn't have our best selves in mind. It's intent on capturing our attention and focusing it where they want, right? This has huge implications for us. One of the things that he says, there are so many things that he mentions in this that are really important for us to understand. Statements that he just makes. He's got some great little phrases throughout the book maybe some of this might be considered a little bit of a primer on the book, for example. I know that not a lot of people are going to read the book. Unless you're used to reading philosophy or theology, it's probably going to be a little dense for you. So hopefully I could boil some of this down and maybe give you some exposure to something you might otherwise not read. But he talks about things like industrialized persuasion. That's what the internet is, industrialized persuasion. And it gives us very small number of people, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, control over fellow human beings. And, you've got to ask serious questions about the amount of control, the amount of influence that there is. Let's see, a couple of other things, a couple of other thoughts that he mentions here, and then I want to share a big one. He talks about, let's see, our information and communication technologies serve as mirrors for our identities, and these mirrors can show us either dignified or undignified reflections of ourselves. When we see a life in the mirror that appears to be diverging from the stars, in other words, the stars that guide us, of freedom and self-authorship by which we want to live, our reaction not only involves the shock of indignity, but also quite often a defensive posture of reactance. He goes on to say reactance refers to the idea that individuals have certain freedoms with regard to their behavior. And if these behavioral freedoms are reduced or threatened with reduction, the individual will be motivationally aroused to regain them. You could see that happening with the whole face mask issue. That's reactance, right? Because we feel the threat of our freedom being impinged upon, right? So the other things that he talks about, when we talk about reading the things in our feed on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever, or in the news feed, wherever you're getting your news, usually we talk about siloed information. In other words, everybody's receiving information in their feed that fits their profile, which means that you're not going to get information outside of it, which means that we continue to isolate and don't have shared categories to relate to one another with. This only pushes us further away and amplifies moral outrage. And we're seeing this happen all over the place. A lot of people talk about it as echo chambers, but he more accurately describes it as something more like feedback, a feedback loop. So if you've ever had a microphone or played a guitar in front of an amp, and all of a sudden it starts to feedback, and it gets louder and louder and louder until basically it wants to break every glass in the window, shatter your eardrums and drive everybody out of the room. And ultimately it'll blow the speakers. That's what's really happening on social media. When we see all of the events that are happening, and especially the magnification, what we're seeing is an amplification, not just an echo. Echoes dissipate, right? If you stand on the edge of a cliff and you go, hello, 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 it goes away. The difference between that and what's happening now over all of the issues that we see, whether they're political or racial or whatever, is that there's an aspect of this that is amplification until we get feedback, and that feedback gets so loud that it creates such a dissonance that it becomes unbearable and it repels. And that's one of the things that's happening here. So I'm looking at this information because I'm looking again at some of the underlying things that are affecting the way we relate to one another. And I wanted to share these thoughts with you. So when you begin to take in this information, I think it's important to understand that maybe what you're part of is a feedback loop that's getting larger and larger and larger and more and more and more extreme, right? And when you begin to realize that, maybe it gives us the ability to say, hold on a second, I'm encountering feedback that's getting glaringly loud and I have to pull back. When you get feedback from a mic, what do? You go and shut down the system. You turn the volume all the way off, right? Because if you leave it on, it's just going to continue, right? You have to shut it off. And we have to know when to shut this off and when to say, am I participating in this feedback? Or can I introduce something else? Can we play with the volumes and the levels until we get the sound right? Because right now, what we're experiencing is out of control amplification. That doesn't mean that some of the issues are not justified, but we also have to understand that if we allow it to amplify the way it does, it becomes destructive. That's really important. Another thing that he mentions, which I think is really important to discuss, is that he says that, let's see, I'll back up a little bit. The proliferation of ubiquitous, that means everywhere, portable and connected general-purpose computers has enabled this infrastructure of individualized persuasion to do an end run around all other societal systems and to open a door directly to our attentional faculties, our ability to pay attention to things and parse it, on which it now operates over a third of our waking hours, our waking lives. In the hands of a few dozen people now lies the power to shape the attentional habits, the lives of billions of people. This is not a situation in which the essential political problem involves the management or censorship of speech. The total effect of these systems on our lives is not analogous to that of past communication media. The effect here is much closer to that of a religion. It is the installation of a worldview, the habituation into certain practices and values, the appeals to tribalistic impulses, the hypnotic abdication of reason and will, and the faith in these omnipresent and seemingly omniscient forces that we trust without a sliver of verification to be on our side. So what you might not understand, and what we need to pay attention to, is that all of these sources of media now are amplified in such a way that they're bypassing other social systems to the point where they're basically acting like they are installing a worldview upon you, right? Imagine a compute. There used to be the day when you would slip in a CD-ROM into your computer and it would install a program, right? Well, what's happening is that all of this media is installing a worldview. If you don't know what a worldview is, it refers to the basic underlying ways in which you understand and parse the world around you. The truths that you hold to be sort of self-evident. A good example, really basic one for Western culture, is that we eat on raised platforms, right? We don't eat on the ground. We don't sit on the ground. We don't put our plates on the ground. We lift everything up. We sit on chairs. We eat at a table, and we even use utensils to eat, because the underlying worldview is things are dirty, and we have to separate them from things that are not dirty. In the same way, all of this media installs a worldview, a way of looking at the world that you might not be choosing. It is being chosen for you. I know you'd like to think, well, I'm far too critical a thinker to allow that to happen. This is bypassing that whole process for many of us. Maybe not for all of you, but the fact is that it is by its very nature bypassing many of those processes, so that what we end up doing is we end up engaging the world with what we could call emotive reasoning. In other words, we make emotional decisions about what is true or what's not true. Believe me, if your friends and the people that you like or associate with like a thing, you're going to like it. This is what enculturation is all about. If you spend enough time with a group of people, you will automatically end up adopting many of their ideas uncritically. And if you do so critically, and if you are highly critical of them, you may end up not becoming friends with those people or being with that group. So part of that is the uncritical, emotional acceptance of a certain amount of information. Well, that's what's happening here, right? All of this media is bombarding you constantly with this feedback loop, telling you this is what the world is. And it's not necessarily so. I know that there are certain truths about all of the things that are being said that are true, right? There are definitely injustices that are occurring in the world. But the intensity, that might not be as accurate as what's being represented. The intensity of our reaction might be unwarranted because it could be driven by this giant feedback loop. I thought it would be important to share these ideas with you, and hopefully I'll get to do some more of this stuff, maybe breaking down some more complicated ideas so that they're easier to digest. I think this is important because our world has been changing really for years now at unprecedented rates. And that is has a very destabilizing effect on society. We're seeing the fracturing of our society in part because of these things. It's not just because we're being tribalistic and, one group of people are good and another group of people are bad. Not at all. What's happening is that the rates of accelerated change things are moving beyond our ability to really grasp or deal with them. It's moving faster than we can deal with it as a society. And that is causing fragmentation, disbelief, a lack of trust. After all, how else can you get a group of people, sorry if I offend you by saying this, but who will actually believe today that the world is flat, right? Flat earthers. Well, that's because we don't believe truths that come to us through all of these sources of information. So I wanted to share these ideas with you, and hopefully it will both give you something of a handle so that you could think about the world in a little bit of a different perspective and go, I think I know what's happening here. Maybe part of why this sounds so crazy or why the voices are getting so extreme is because the technology is amplifying this in ways that are not healthy and not good and do not promote human flourishing or a well-ordered society or social unity. That's an important thing to recognize. If the technologies that we are accessing information by their very nature, undermine the very basis for social unity, how can we be a united people? You can't do that. So, as much as Mark Zuckerberg and others would like to appear before Congress and talk about how, they're trying to make sense of their platform and make sure it's aligned with our best interests, you have to understand that right now it's not. It's just not. And you have to take authority. You have to take responsibility for what you're listening to. You have to take responsibility for listening with generosity to the people that you're listening to on your feed or on the news or something. You have to take responsibility to think rationally through the consequences of what this person says or that person says or what you're saying. You have to think critically about what you post on Facebook. If it's inflammatory, is it a way that promotes open dialogue and communication? Or does it turn the dial up on that amplification? Does it actually cause people to become more upset and polarized? Does it cause them to take opposing sides? You're in control of that. The algorithm is not in control of that, but the algorithm can promote that. And that's what it does, because negative emotions are more reactive. In other words, the algorithms, this is intentional, the algorithms are designed to make use of your ability to act. And when you're upset, you're more likely to act. You're more likely to hit, I don't like that. If you're at peace and you're calm, you're less likely to engage some of these things, which lowers their profitability. How's that for a thought, right? Anyway, a lot of complicated things going on in the world, and I hope that you found that this breaks that down a little bit for you in a way that's easier to understand. I hope it gives you some tools, like I was saying before, to navigate it a little bit better, and also to think about how it is that you're communicating and how you are listening to everything that's going on. Anyway, God bless you, and hopefully we'll do more of this. God bless. Bye.